Okay, so we're already now up to presentation number 5, I think, and it's kind of time for us to do a little bit more discussion and have a look at some scenarios that can come up in the real world. We've been looking through in presentations 1 through 4 into the kind of situations that arise, the kind of situations that arise when you're at that feasibility starting stage. Now, as we always used to love to say, everyone's happy at the planning stage. That isn't necessarily true. And so what you're doing at this stage is you're highlighting areas where you think issues are going to occur so that you can hit those issues, so that you can plan for those issues and be ready for them when they happen, and that you can have a flexible plan which will give us a solution that we want. The solution, of course, being, if you remember, that what we're looking for is we're looking for an accounting system which provides the best information so that the government involved or the ministry involved or even the UN agency, the NATO, whoever, to make the best decisions. But that's kind of what we've brought us now. So what I wanted to do now is have a little of these couple of these little discussion topics. So we've got just 2 slides here, both of which are kind of scenarios that you can expect to see in real life. And the kind of things that you should be thinking about going into these meetings. Like everything else in life, making IPSAS implementation work is a big social effort. So you need to make friends with the people that you're dealing with. You need to have some understanding of where they're coming from, the pressures that they're under, so that the solution you present also works for them and gives them the opportunity to work with you and to take a little bit of credit and to get some results that they may want as well. Very often other people will try and bolt things onto your project, and before you knock them back, just find out what effort it's going to take. The more goodwill you can spread, the better it is, because everyone's going to know your name when you're doing this. Right, okay, so discussion number 2, just before we start, please, it says in big red letters at the bottom there, please remember this, remember to download the workbook. I'll put a link underneath this on YouTube, down on YouTube, so it'll be on the free resources, but remember to download it, because all the stuff that I'm saying, I'm just kind of sitting here at my desk and going through this, but there's some more stuff in there. And this kind of stuff is very, very useful. So, in a normal lecture room, you can take a minute to read this yourself. So you're Penelope Pitstop, for those of you old enough to remember her. And she is the IPSAS advocate, assuming that there is such a thing in Rajasthan, and Rajasthan is a country in Central Asia. Has a population of 10 million, so a fairly small country. 20% Christian, 80% Muslim, so you've got some mix there between the religions. And the country has little infrastructure, suffers from permanent drought, like so many countries in that region do. And there's really only one trading company of any size. The population is heavily involved in agriculture, again, as most of these places are. And unlike so many of them, there are a few countries down there, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, don't have the same levels of natural resources that others like Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan do. So your natural resources are few. And rather unusually for, assuming in this country down here, is that the literacy levels are low. Usually in that region, literacy levels are pretty high. And that's important because you can write stuff down in terms of training courses. Yeah. So you, in your role as Penelope, is about to meet the Minister of Finance. And the Minister of Finance wears 2 hats. One is Minister of Finance and the other is a religious leader. And you're going to go there and try and persuade him as to why his country should undertake an IPSAS implementation program. So that's the information that you've got there. If you are an ICAEW student or you are an ACCA student, you want to try and put some structure into this. And so in terms of your planning, and in fact, even if you're not a student, you want to put some structure into it. So for those of you who've been through some kind of MBA or university course, you want to use some kind of like Michael Porter's analysis, or you want to use some PEST or some environmental analysis or something. I think in the answer I used PEST analysis. In fact, I have the piece of paper here. If I look at it, I used a PEST analysis. For those of you who don't know, PEST analysis, political, economic, social, and technological. And then I tapped on a couple of other little things as well in a kind of all-encompassing other little section. So those of you who've got the workbook in front of you, I don't recommend that you actually look at it just now. Look at it at the end, see if there's anything that you've missed. And again, we come back to this idea that there is no such thing as a correct answer. So therefore, if you're thinking of something and you don't see in the answer, you must never consider that you're wrong. That's just, we can't think of everything when we write these things. So just running through these things, therefore, If you're going to use some form of framework, therefore, such as PEST, let's start with political. In terms of political, one of the things that IPSAS has, or something that IPSAS hasn't addressed, is it hasn't addressed Muslim finance. Muslim finance is a huge growing area, and this kind of assumption that fundamental Muslim governments are against making money is an absolute misnomer. So it's possible, if you're going to a country like this, that you may need to have someone around you who has some knowledge of Muslim finance and what the correct etiquette is, and what the correct way to word things, particularly in your system design. Yeah? Oracle ultimately is an American company, so they'll understand you, but the locals need to make sure that it's in a context which is understandable, socially correct, and fits with the way that they live their lives. It's maybe a little bit of an unfair stereotype, and I have to say I've worked in many Muslim countries and I've never come across this before, but it's something that you should be aware of. I have heard of a couple of people who've had this. If you're dealing with someone who's a senior Muslim official, you may find he may have an issue with dealing with a woman. Nothing that's ever happened to me. I'm obviously a man, but I've gone to meetings taking my team. My team have got women with me, and in fact, dealing in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, that are both Muslim countries, the person who was leading the project on their side, on the government side, in both cases were women, so there was no problem there in either of those countries. But it's something that you may need to be aware of, cultural awareness, just ensuring that the makeup of the team is correct and that you are dealing with the social niceties of the country that you're in, because it's their country and they make the rules, and so you have to do that. So politically, therefore, we've got this idea that we have a country. We can combine economic into this. The country basically doesn't have any money, so it says that they're heavily involved in agriculture, so there's a flag there that IPSAS agriculture is going to be important to you. Few natural resources to generate expert revenue, literacy levels are low. What we're really talking about, therefore, is the fact that the country doesn't have any money. So you're going to have to be very, very conscious of what you start recommending. And it's telling us, I guess if we switch over now to technology, we're talking as well about infrastructure. So in terms of the country, therefore, there's little infrastructure. So therefore, we may be looking at using a paper system or some kind of mix, or setting up regional hubs that are close to ensure that the information that you've got is correct. Right, let's just take a break there and make sure that we've got this thing correctly written out. So politically, we're saying that they're a Muslim country, and it may be an issue, therefore, that we need to take into account something to do with Muslim finance. Possibly not. Never happened to me in Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, but it might be an issue. Secondly, if you are going to be the lead in your role as Penelope, you need to be careful of your social status, just to make sure, again, it may be no issue whatsoever. Economically, the country is poor, right? If the country is poor and we're not going to get a big wodge of cash coming through because of sales or because the oil price rises or something, price is going to be a very big issue here. The country is not going to have unlimited X numbers of millions of dollars to ship in the latest technology in terms of Oracle systems and so on. It's likely, if they're in that region and they're underdeveloped, that their economy is very, very heavily dependent on aid. So you will have Asian Development Bank, you will have USAID, who are giving money as opposed to World Bank, which is lending money. So they're giving money, and so maybe therefore we can get attached to this some upgrade of the computer system and some infrastructure built from aid money. That will depend on the political aims of the donors. And you get some odd ones as well. You'll find that the New Zealanders and the Australians crop up in these areas. As a general rule, New Zealanders and Australians give money only for economic, but if we can show cost benefit, this is going to benefit the country, then we would fall within that. Technological, we have this idea that there's very little infrastructure, and it tells us that literacy levels are low, so therefore it's probably going to be very, very hard to get a big ERP system up and running and going well, because even if IBM provide you with a reconditioned system from one of their clients in America, the fact is that it's not going to work if there's no internet infrastructure, and you're going to find that it's a massive training exercise to get the people up to actually using this thing, because they'll just have that computer blank that happens to people. you know, when you're brought up in Europe, when you're brought up in America, wherever, in South America and so on as well. Now you go to school, and at school you have Microsoft Word, so you learn how to use Word, you learn how to use Excel and so on. For people in very poor countries, they don't have that, and there's actually very few resources on how do you do the really simple things. How do you add up a column of figures? If you've worked with Excel for anything over an hour, you'll know it, but you don't get that if you're coming from a country where there are no computers. So, political, Muslim country, economic, they don't have any cash. We've now got these social issues that literacy levels are very low. The one thing which is a positive in most of these countries is that you find that the population tends to be very young. So therefore, if you have a very young population, you'll find that they'll learn quickly, and you'll find a project like this where you've got a bunch of Westerners coming in, you'll get a lot of young people who go out of their way to attach themselves to that project, find out what's going on, get up to date. And the younger people as well are probably maybe even using internet cafes where there's Facebook and MySpace and so on. So these guys are okay. So socially, we've got this idea, therefore, that you've probably got demographics which are actually going to work in your favor. Technologically, right? Other issues. There's one big other issue which when I wrote this, I specifically put in it. The name of the guy is Salim Ajim, and the name of the company is Akhtar Ajim. Now that is something that if you were doing this in countries which figure on world corruption indices and so on, you want to be looking at. You want to be finding out what is the relationship between the guy who is the Minister of Finance and what is the relationship with the guy who runs this company. Once again, you have absolutely no basis for making any judgments, but it's something that you would jot down just to try and find out. Have a chat with the people in your office, the locals, see what information you can find out from them. If they come from the same tribe, or even worse, if they're actually brothers or something like that, you may find that there is a close relationship between them. If that is the case, it is unlikely that your Minister of Finance is going to be falling over themselves to introduce a new purchasing system and to introduce a system of transparency within the system. Now, it may be that it's just a complete coincidence. You just don't know. You can't accuse anyone, and just because you're in Rajasthan doesn't mean their people are likely to be any more corrupt than anyone else anywhere else in the world. But you kind of need to find that stuff out, and it's something that would flag for you going into a country in somewhere like Central Asia. Okay, I hope therefore that you have your 5 headings. Your 5 headings are pest, political, economic, social, technological, and then on my little list I've got here other. If there are other things which you want to say, then you're probably correct. You're probably right. And remember, you can always come in and ask us. Have a look therefore at the workbook and see what's happening in our workbook. Let's just move on to therefore to discussion 3. Discussion 1, as you remember, was back in part 1 or part 2 of these lectures. So discussion 2 looked at Penelope Pitstop, a lady, possibly a young lady, in the country of Rajasthan, which was a country which had shortage of economic resources. And she was trying to persuade them that they should undertake IPSAS. And we were looking at the kind of issues that that country would have with introducing IPSAS. I have to say there's something that I didn't mention during the narrative for slide number 1, is that what would probably happen therefore is that you would be able to persuade Rajasthan to begin to move towards IPSAS. So at that kind of level we would talk therefore about moving to cash IPSAS rather than moving to accruals, and then at the same time beginning to tighten up your controls and your accounting for your assets, beginning to look at financial instruments and so on with a view to bringing in a modified cash basis. So it's this idea that we don't go from 0 to 100 immediately, that we begin to take steps down a process. And hopefully when you've gone to cash basis that we can persuade them that there's some kind of advantages to this, and then therefore that they will buy into the full accruals thing, or full accruals will come in the future. It's also worth saying in a country like that as well, former Soviet countries, they tend to have large university sectors, so the universities will work with you. The other thing which is useful is if it's in Central Asia, it's either a former Soviet republic or it's probably a former colony of Great Britain, so therefore it will have things like an asset register, because under the historic accounting system set up under those powers, these things were created. All things I should have added into slide number 1, discussion number 2. Right, slide number 2, discussion number 3. So have a look at your slide. Now we've got the opposite situation. We have a country which is called Northland, and as my country, Scotland, is just looking to decide whether it should go for independence or not, a discussion that's close to my heart. So Northland is a European country which has successfully resisted the introduction of accrual accounting. Well done with that. Dig Stumpson is the Vice Finance Minister, and he has some experience of IFRS, and he's putting together a paper on the way forward. Right, the fact that he has some understanding of IFRS is kind of good and bad news, therefore. But the good news is that you can talk to him like a qualified accountant, and we can discuss these things with him. The bad news is that a little bit of knowledge is always a dangerous thing. In terms of what the question actually asks you to do, I'm coming at this again now like an ACCA lecture, but what arguments would you put forward to explain why project management is different for the public sector from the private sector? If this was real life, you would hope that Dig would understand this better than you do, as he presumably is trained in one of the big four accountancy firms before moving into the government. And then secondly, why IPSAS might be more appropriate. That's a conversation you could have. It's amazing, even at this stage in the 21st century, how many people really don't know what IPSAS is. Talking to the technical group in Edinburgh that look at accounting for Audit Scotland, very few of them actually know what IPSAS are, because they have no relevance to them in Britain. So if you're going to approach this as you were, an ACCA student, the kind of stuff you would talk about is all the things that we talked about that would be different, that are different in public sector from private sector. So we had that great long slide where I talked for about 10 or 15 minutes about the differences. So it's the key points that come straight off of that slide. So please, I'm just going to flick to I'm going to cheat madly now and just flick to my workbook and see what I wrote in my workbook. So the kind of things that we would have here, therefore, would be, if we're looking at, it specifically says project management as well, doesn't it? Oh, okay, so project management will be different. The projects tend to be longer and more expensive. So your projects tend to be much, much larger. Building airports and so on and so forth. You may well outsource the actual capital building of them, but your projects have a longer life. Projects have a longer life, and the assets involved may well be larger and more expensive. So there's a big difference there, because the way that you calculate, therefore, and you look at your net present value will be slightly different. Other things, therefore, if we're just looking at projects, if we're looking at net present value calculations, therefore, so just go through them, the cash flows will be longer, which makes them harder to calculate. If you're looking at longer periods of time, remember we talked about the Channel Tunnel. You have to be careful not to simply stretch the project out forever, because if you stretch the thing out forever, then it will always have a positive net present value. It kind of has to. It must be positive. So we have this idea, therefore, that projects are longer, the assets may be more expensive, so we've got more of an investment in the assets. The other thing as well is that the project may effectively be irreversible. If you decide to build a nuclear power station to provide power, once that thing is built, you can't go back. You can't decide a year down the line, no, we won't do that, we'll do something different. It's an irreversible decision. You're stuck with the decision. So the irreversibility of decisions. If Tesco's open a store, they're probably going to take a piece of land, build a shop. It's a difficult decision a year in, but they can do it because it's one store of 250. Build a nuclear power station and you shut the thing down and people don't have electric. So therefore we have this idea of irreversible decisions. Other things as well, I hope you're all okay with this idea of discounted cash flows. If you just look at your discount rate for a government will be different. It'll be lower. It'll be lower because the risk is lower. The risk purely in the financial sense is that the government will have the money. They must have freed up the money. Whereas it's possible that someone like Tesco's could run out of money. Actually, having said that, if it's a government outside of Britain, outside of Western Europe, maybe it's not so sure. But usually, I would imagine that your discount rate will be lower. It will certainly be lower than a public organisation because your cost of borrowing, it ought to be lower. The cost of borrowing will be lower. So, we talked about length of the project, we talked about the assets, now we're talking about the discount rate itself. We're saying that the discount rate will be lower because the risk of the project should be lower because you know you're going to build it. It will be lower because the government should be able to borrow funds more cheaply than a private company. And the discount rate should be lower because you don't have to pay any tax. If Tesco's makes a profit from their shop, they pay whatever it is now, 25% or something in tax in Britain. If the government makes a profit, there's no tax. Government doesn't pay tax on its stuff. So therefore, we would expect the discount rate to be lower. So in terms of our project, therefore, your assets are likely to be longer rate, there's irreversibility, longer project, and your discount rate's lower because of lower risk, because lower cost of borrowing, and because of net tax. There you go, you've got 5 or 6 points now. Now I'm just going to cheat wildly now and have a look here. No, I've actually just trotted out the same points that I wrote down there. So that's always quite reassuring. Consistency in my answer. Excuse me. Right, there we go. So what arguments would you put forward to explain why project management is different? I hope you got your points there. Remember to look at your workbook. According to your workbook, it's under slide number 22. So therefore, with slide number 22, you will see the points listed there. Secondly, from the private sector, why might IPSAS be more appropriate for the ministry? Right, it doesn't actually say in the question more appropriate than what, but I think that the inference you can take from that is IFRS. He's trained with the top accounting practice and he is comfortable with IFRS. I think the implication, therefore, is that STIG or DIG, whatever his name is going to be focusing on or around IFRS. And your job, conceivably, is to persuade him to go for IPSAS. I think in the 21st century where we are now with IPSAS, I think we can comfortably say that IPSAS are better suited to governments than IFRS. I mean, on the grounds that the IPSAS board take IFRS and then they change them to make them government friendly, government specific, I think that there's a quite clear trend, message, whatever you want to say, a fact. Let's call it a fact. I suppose it's not a fact, but let's call it a fact that IPSAS are better for governments. They're specifically written for governments, and that the people who are on the IPSAS board are either ex-government accountants or ex-vice ministers of finance, whatever. So your standards are more applicable. I think that's your overriding argument. Why would you take IFRS? For countries like Great Britain, they took IFRS because IPSAS didn't exist when they started. But the things do now. So if we're starting this process in 2014, we should be looking for IPSAS. I think if we approach this, therefore, in terms of dealing with DIG as an ACCA student, I think it's like we saw before, that you take one point and then expand it, what we used to call the old can opener when I was a student. So IPSAS are specifically written for governments. So that's your first point. So therefore, if they are specifically written for governments, there are specific accounting transactions that relate to governments. There are specific disclosure requirements that relate to governments, on the grounds that the US at some point may move much closer towards IPSAS, but the EU definitely is. The EU is currently, as I'm chatting away here, talking about EPSAS, which will be the European Public Sector Accounts. So IPSAS and EPSAS will be much closer. So therefore, in fact, what's going to happen to this guy is that when EPSAS become the law, if he's got IPSAS, he'll probably find he complies completely. If he goes with IFRS, he won't. The French are making massive noises about financial instruments once again. They seem to find it too hard to implement. So therefore, it's possible if he goes with IFRS, he's going to have to make more changes down the route, whereas he can steal a march here, get a big step ahead with that. So therefore, he's got that. So what did we get to therefore? So they are specific because of that, the specific accounting transactions, the budget requirements, the specific standards that relate to government, the specific disclosure requirements, standards that relate to government. If EPSAS are introduced, the changes from IPSAS to EPSAS are likely to be cosmetic, whereas they're likely to be fairly large for IFRS. And other things is if he has any questions on it, if he's trying to understand the rationale and the logic of the IPSAS board is made up of people who have a background in public finance, and so therefore it will be easier for him to talk to them to get the same mentality, to get an understanding of the transactions, than it will with the IASB. The other thing as well is that my experience is that trying to deal with the IASB as the representative for one country's central bank is actually quite difficult. they pigeonhole you into a committee, and moving out of that committee is hard. They don't have the research staff to the same degree, whereas the IPSAS board is much more supportive. Just my personal opinion. Okay, have a look at the notes therefore, but you should have this idea therefore that they are more appropriate because they're written for governments, the people who write them work for governments, disclosure requirements, transactions for governments, and because in the future it's a European country, so assuming it's in the EU, EU standards will map to IPSAS rather than IFRS. There you go, a couple little discussions. These things are based on the kind of discussions that we actually have in real life. So if you're going out there to join an implementation team, have a look at that, because these are the kind of things you're going to be doing in real life. There's a number of countries out there as well that are bringing in at the moment IPSAS. So if anyone's working on a team and there's anything I can help with, please let me know. Move on to the next one now, which will be number 6. Thank you for that.